Welcome back to Pleistocene, Glaciations, and You, Part 3. Now what we see here is a Pleistocene bear dog, which is neither, although as you can tell from its head here, probably a significant interrupter of Pleistocene hikes. By 40,000 years ago, climate was heading towards the late glacial maximum. Temperatures globally were declining, droughts were persisting, glaciers, ice sheets, and deserts were all expanding due to the change in atmospheric circulation. Sea level was decreasing. People, plants, and animals had to adapt or become extinct. Now, pictured here is a group of animals that were commonly recovered from the La Brea tar pits, which is located essentially in Hollywood, California, which is part of Los Angeles, California. So this is a scene that you would have seen in downtown LA if you were around 40,000 years ago. Now, it was during this period of time that people spread out. They spread to the Americas and they spread to Australia. And they spread to these places because of the Pleistocene glaciations. The earliest records we have of these humans comes from the paintings and sketches that we looked at earlier in the course, principally in the walls of caves in France and Spain. And they range in age from 40 to 50,000 years in terms of the oldest examples. So what we see are commonly images of things that people would have experienced. Hunting scenes, pictures of the animals that they relied upon, in some cases the techniques that they used. Similar cave paintings are found in the southern Urals, which is in western Russia today. In this example, we see 7 mammoths and 2 rhinoceroses, as well as a bunch of horses. There was a large mammoth camp found near here on the Pekora River in the northeast of European Russia. About 98% of the bones that are found in these dwellings and adjacent to the dwellings are mammoth bones. And because of this, it's thought that people were only eating mammoths in this area. Now, we can see from early European modern humans, which are sometimes called Cro-Magnon, or at least formerly they were called Cro-Magnon, were wearing fairly sophisticated clothing that was decorated and had hoods, and they wore pants and also boots. In North America, humans were living in the ice-free areas of Alaska, north of the ice sheets during the last ice age. They probably came across the plain which linked Alaska to Siberia. This is known as Beringia. This wasn't a causeway like University Bridge, for instance. This was a vast, dry plain. You wouldn't know you were anywhere near an ocean if you were in the middle of this plain. The dry land existed because world sea level was about 100 meters lower than today, and we have genetic information on Aboriginal Americans that suggests they come from Asia, most likely from this land bridge walking across Beringia. There's some other evidence that goes back a few tens of thousands of years earlier that suggests that people may have walked over from Europe during the Ice Age as well. Distribution of the earliest dated archaeological human occupations in the Americas suggests they arrived during the Ice Age. And there's some probability of an ice-free corridor through Alberta, which you can see here. This would have allowed them to move from Alaska down into the unglaciated portion of North America that makes up most of the U.S. today. Genetic information suggests there were about 10,000 people on Earth at 130,000 years before present. These are 10,000 Homo sapien. And it's estimated there were about 1 million people by 30,000 years ago. So it took us about 100,000 years to go from 10,000 people to 1 million people at this time. Now there's a wooden hut that was discovered in France, dated to a previous glacial period, the Mindel glaciation, somewhere around 400,000 years ago. What's interesting is this hut includes a hearth or fireplace, and it's surrounded by branches worked into a circle and then weighted down, protected by a series of stones. Now we find these types of stone circles throughout the Paleolithic. That's the Old Stone Age. The basic design of these habitations remained pretty much unchanged for about 1 million years. Most likely these people were Neanderthals. They were hunters, and adjacent to their site they found a variety of bones, the archaeologists did, that include elephant, rhinoceros, red deer, ibex, and giant ox. So these would have been the animals that they hunted. So we have human history beginning around 50,000 years ago. A little seems to change until about 20,000 years ago. People were living as hunter-gatherers until about 20,000 years ago. from 20,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, with the origin of farming, we have the development of towns and ultimately civilization. The peak of the last ice age was about 20,000 years ago. That's known as the late glacial maximum, or the LGM. Most people that were living at this time survived by retreating to places where firewood and food could be found. So they left areas that were previously occupied and moved to these new areas, which were more rare, but people were relatively rare at the time as well. So people transitioned from living in caves to living in shelters and huts that may have been in caves, to living in tents, something that's a little more mobile, lighter, easier to manage, and then ultimately houses. Once agriculture started and people remained in the same spot, it was worth their time and effort to build a permanent house. So just after 22,000 years ago, global warming begins. In this case, it's not global warming in the strict scientific definition sense. It's a warming climate. Initially, this was slow but spiky or uneven. At about 17,000 years ago, the ice sheets began to melt in a big way. And by 14,000 years ago, climate begins to fluctuate between warmth and rain to cold and dry. Shortly after 12,000 years ago, we hit a big burst of warmth, and this is the beginning of the Holocene, which is also known as the recent, and this is when human history really begins. By 7,000 years ago, people throughout the world were living by farming principally. New types of plants and animals appeared. They were domesticated. And farmers that domesticated these new plants and animals inhabited permanent villages and towns that were large enough to support specialists, people that make things, blacksmiths, for instance, people that made wheels once the wheel came into vogue, and people that would provide priestly services and some control, crowd control, the chiefs. This is not the first time the planet had warmed up. Ancestors of ours, including Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Desnoians, and Homo neanderthalensis, lived through equivalent periods of climate change. Now, these people had larger brains, larger muscles than us. These larger brains and larger muscles require lots of fat and protein to keep them fueled, to keep them operational. So maybe it's the demise of the characteristic megafauna that contributed to the demise of the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Homo sapiens had a smaller brain, smaller muscles. Maybe they were smarter, better scavengers, better scroungers like magpies. So these people responded by expanding, contracting populations. They adapted to changing environments, and they adjusted the tools they made to fit the new conditions. Rather than creating history, they adapted. There was no good written record of their activity between 22,000 and 7,000 years ago that describes their lives and events in their lives. What we do have to rely on for information is the garbage they left behind. Things like stone tools, pottery, fireplaces, food debris, deserted dwellings, and many other archaeological artifacts, such as monuments, burials, and rock art. The record also comes from things they left behind accidentally, such as pollen grains, beetle wings, beetles that would be associated with human habitations, and isotope values of sediment and midden materials. We can take these things that are recovered from these sites, analyze them for their isotope values, and determine what these things were, what they represented, and gain additional environmental information from them. From 20,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, most Stone Age people lived in small family bands. They occupied territories that were large enough to allow them to move about, to obtain the resources they needed, and in doing so, they developed very flexible survival strategies. This is a photo of Bantu tribesmen in South Africa today. If one of these small foraging bands experienced 2 consecutive dry years, they would just move to a better watered area or fall back to using less desirable plant foods, sometimes things that require more energy to harvest, more work for the benefit, a tougher nut to crack. Now, the shift in these vegetation zones and their faunas, including the ranges of birds and fish, are going to be controlled by the environment. In Europe, open plains were taken over first by pioneering species like birches, later by a mixed birch and pine forest. Ultimately, this is going to be replaced by warmer weather flora, such as hazel, oak, ulmus, and lime. And these woodland types would have been accompanied by insects that are attracted to those types of trees. as well as the birds and animals that are attracted to those particular ecosystems. Gradually, these species extend their ranges. They're establishing their seasonal routes that are going to change with changing climate, changing global climate. The start and stop points of migration are going to change. So animals and people have to adapt to these changing environments by changing their behavior. Now, if the people are relying on a particular type of plant or animal, they have to follow that change in the behavior of that plant or animal. If they're not able to do that, then there are extinctions. And there were many extinctions. The charismatic megafauna, the woolly mammoths, for instance, are wiped out. They didn't make the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. Some of these extinctions are going to be related to climate. Some are going to be related to overexploitation by people whose populations were rising. When we look at Europe, this is a modern coastal map of Europe, so it's not accurate for the time period shown here. But what you can get out of this diagram is that 12,000 years ago, oak forests were limited to adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. By 10,000 years ago, they begin spreading further north. By 6,000 years ago, we're up into Scandinavia. All of the British Isles are occupied by oak trees. And by 2,000 years ago, thick, large oak forests covered all of continental Europe except central and northern Scandinavia. So we transitioned from cold, dry, and windy to relatively warm, wet, less seasonal. This brings us to the time when every place was within walking distance, if you had the time, as Stephen Wright would say. Tasmania, Australia, New Guinea are adjoined land masses. Borneo, Java, Thailand also joined together to form the largest rainforest on Earth. The Sahara, Gobi, and other deserts are much larger. Britain is a peninsula of Europe. It's not an island. Its north is under ice, its south is a polar desert, and much of North America is covered with ice at this time. So the net result is sea level has dropped, exposing lots of land. In southern France, people were building houses out of mammoth bones at the end of the Pleistocene. In this case, this structure was discovered in 1908 in Mézines, which is between Burgundy and Toulouse in France. The bones were still standing, so imagine building a house tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago and it's still standing. These mammoth hunters built entire huts out of mammoth bones. They covered them with hides, they stitched the hides together, and they used either bones or rocks to weigh down the corners. They also had the time and skill to make tools, art, musical instruments from the tusks, and based on the remains that are found around these settlements, it's likely they ate nothing but mammoth meat. This is a shot from the Natural History Museum in Vienna, using myself as a scale. This tent was made out of mammoth bones and hides, probably filled with mammoth hides, although other furs such as foxes, wolves, and bearskins were used as well. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, Lake Tiberias, which is now known as the Sea of Galilee, was occupied by the Pushkari people. These are Homo sapiens. This is about 22,000 years ago. This site, called a hollow, consisted of dwellings made of brushwood by people wearing garments made out of hide and plant fibers. The hunter-gatherers of the forest steppe that lived at this village either burned it down by accident or they burned it down on purpose to eliminate pests like fleas and lice. And fortunately for us, within a few years, rising lake levels flooded the site, and eventually it was covered with some sediment, and the site itself was preserved along with the things that they ate, the tools that they used, and we're given a good example, a good depiction of the lifestyle that they led. So the changes that occur at the end of the Pleistocene were pretty substantial, pretty drastic for people and animals that were alive at that time. In many parts of the world, populations live near the sea, most likely for the same reasons they do today. There's an opportunity for catching fish. You can evaporate seawater to get salt. Salt is important as a preservative prior to refrigeration. Drying things out with salt was the primary way to preserve protein in particular for a period of time. So the good news for us is it's likely that population centers of the Ice Age, the end of the Ice Age, are underwater today. So they're probably preserved to a pretty good degree in many places around the world because of this rise in sea level. The end of the Ice Age, this rise of sea level probably reduced the number of people. substantially. And this is a rare event in history. Happened around 80,000 years ago. There's a large eruption, Toba, that almost wiped out humans entirely. So that's a rare thing, though. And because it's a dramatic event that happens around the world, it's likely that this may have given rise to many of the legends of the great floods of ancient times. Now, this is a depiction of a reconstruction of sea level rise in a number of different locations. Determining sea level rise in the past is far more difficult than you can imagine. Because of isostatic rebound, you remove the weight of ice, land pops up. If the land is on a coast and you're trying to measure sea level where the land is moving up and down, that makes it a whole lot more difficult. So by putting a bunch of locations from around the world together in a single plot, we get a better depiction of what really happened in a global sense. The land around the northernmost end of the Baltic is still going up due to this rebound. We remove the weight of the Scandinavian ice sheet from this landmass, and it responds by rising up. It's rising at about 1 centimeter per year, even to this day. The total rise since the last glacial maximum is estimated to be 270 to 300 meters. It's a pretty big rise in a landmass. Along with this rise in sea level comes an advance of forest over large areas of tundra and grass. Now, looking at the Caribbean, we see a horrifying sight. Florida is 3 times its current size, if you can imagine that. The Yucatan Peninsula, much larger. Cuba is about 30% larger than it is today, and so on and so forth around the world. Looking at Indonesia, you can see that Southeast Asia is pretty much walkable, if you can walk through the jungle, to just off the coast of Australia. So if you had a decent map or intelligent friends, they could tell you how to get from, say, Sri Lanka to Tasmania by walking with just a couple short canoe trips between some islands here. Maybe a little more clearly depicted here. The Sundaland is all underwater now. So all the people that lived around here, all those sites are maybe still preserved under this water, the water of the Java Sea. Off the coast of Canada, Vancouver Island here, we've worked at a couple of these archaeological sites. We can see where people were living, what they were living on, and get a pretty good idea of their lifestyle from the remains that are recovered from these shelf deposits. 15,000 years ago, the glaciers are shrinking. Fresh water is pouring into the ocean around the world. Our Ice Age charismatic fauna are being wiped out by climate and people. Hunter-gatherer populations are now approaching 8.5 million at 15,000 years ago. At this point, the world is full. We've reached the carrying capacity, and people begin to crowd into smaller places, smaller territories, and they do this permanently. Now, an advantage of having a permanent camp is you can leave all your stuff here. It's like going on vacation. However, you don't want other people getting your stuff. Staying here year-round allows you to protect it. And it also allows you to protect this property, so another band of people doesn't move in and take over. So it starts to become advantageous to stay in one spot year-round. Danish archaeologists, on the other hand, have recovered entire Stone Age camps preserved under the waters of the Baltic. They found the traps people used to catch fish. They found canoes. They found perfectly preserved wooden artifacts, including barbed spears. And the reason they could draw on so many food resources is that they lived in the same place for a long period of time. They developed the technology required to get at their food most competitively. So with sea level rising rapidly, continental shelves are flooded, coastal plains are flooding, and the world's geography is changing dramatically. The Americas become a separate continent by 11,000 years ago. Britain becomes an island about 5,000 years after that. And rivers like the Mississippi and the Nile form fertile floodplains as they fill up their valleys. These Stone Age people were opportunistic, accustomed to sudden climate change, and able to adapt to it in ways that became impossible when populations rose rapidly after the last ice age. So when people are mobile, they can respond rapidly and appropriately to environmental change. When you put down roots, as they say, you live in one spot, you're kind of anchored to that spot, and whatever change occurs at that spot has to be dealt with right there. So this was the case starting 11,000 years ago when farming appeared. The Earth's population wasn't quite at the carrying point, but it was pretty close. 14,300 years ago, Aimalaha, a village of the Natufian culture, consists of 5 to 6 dwellings with walls dug into hillsides, kind of like a hillside cottage, and these low walls were covered with brushwood and hides, kind of like a advanced tent. This is the first village, and after this, people don't really go back from farming. Most people don't. 13,000 years ago, in the Euphrates River Valley, there were thick stands of wild cereal grasses and oak trees, and enormous elk herds running back and forth through the spring and fall. Fish were common. Hundreds of families lived on the edge of the valley where food was so abundant they could stay there for most of the year, if not year-round. One of these settlements was Abu Huraira, a small group of circular houses dug into the ground, much like the site we had just mentioned in Aimalaha. Abu Huraira stood close to the river floodplain and also close to the forest. People lived on hackberries, wild plums, nuts, and gazelle meat. This warming, the post-glacial warming, was going to be interrupted. And it's going to be interrupted by Manitoba. The Laurentide ice sheet that covered eastern North America for 100,000 years was melting. And it was melting increasingly rapidly. As it's melting, enormous amounts of fresh water are pouring into mostly the Gulf of Mexico. But this is going to change. Icebergs are going to break off the eastern margins of the ice cap, dumping a half a meter of small rocks. This is ice-rafted debris, drop stones, from the Hudson Bay region onto the floor of the Labrador Sea. As this ice sheet melts, Lake Agassiz becomes a large pro-glacial lake here, covering much of Manitoba, part of Saskatchewan, North Dakota, Minnesota. This lake is about the volume of the modern Laurentian Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. So it fills up with the land being pushed down like a big guy standing on a couch depressing the cushions. The water's going to fill up that space, and as this ice melts, it's going to find a conduit over here to shoot out into the North Atlantic. So it stops draining south into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley, and up here, this is the Cuyahoga River Valley. It stops going this way and starts going this way. So as this happens, Lake Agassiz pours into the North Atlantic about the same amount of water in 3 weeks or so as the modern Laurentian Great Lakes. So all this fresh water slides into the North Atlantic, forms a cap like oil and vinegar and salad dressing, and that prevents thermohaline circulation. So within a decade, recent work that we've done indicates maybe a year, the downwelling that carries salt into the deep ocean and its movement southward stops. This conveyor belt that was pumping warm water and heat from the low latitudes to the high latitudes suddenly stops. And as salt ceases to flow away from the Northern Ocean, global warming stops within a couple of years, maybe a year. Glaciers advance again, and we go back into a 1,300-year cold period. Suddenly, at the end of this cold period, Atlantic downwelling starts again, and the conveyor belt switches on. It's stayed on since then. Now we see in great detail from a lake in Ireland. This is Loch Mare. It's Lake of the King compared to the Greenland Ice Sheet Project here. So the best record of Northern Hemisphere climate, one of the best, is this GISP record here in blue. Now we came along, we cored a lake in Ireland, and we generated a record that's about 50 times the resolution. So we have 50 data for every one down here, roughly. And we could see that the beginning of this cold period was a very rapid transition. Went from essentially interglacial to glacial in, again, a year, maybe a couple of years. In Albufeira, this was catastrophic. So there was an early occupation period that lasted about 4,500 years that was shut down by this cold period. People went from hunter-gatherer to starting to be farmers, back to hunter-gatherer when it got cold. So they transitioned away from eating gazelle, wild pig, and wild ass, along with the wild grains they relied on. Houses became filled with debris, and they abandoned this place, their village, during the Younger Dryas period. The Younger Dryas brought severe drought to the Euphrates Valley. Cold wind, reduced rainfall, and depleted nut harvest changed the town suddenly. The forest that they relied on for nuts moved about 100 kilometers away. That's not impossible to reach, but it's much more difficult. The people came to rely on wild cereal grasses and drought-resistant clovers to supplement these reduced nut harvests. And this is different from what they would have done in the past. Previously, they would have just left, and they would have relied on family and other relationships to get by in the bad years. But this is too bad for everybody. So the result is local game populations crash. People survive because they have some botanical knowledge and their food gathering technology. They started planting acorn wheat to supplement decreasing wild stands and thereby increase their food supply. Pretty soon, these supplements become staples. And within a couple of generations, the foragers become farmers. Albufeira expands, like Saskatoon, rapidly evolving into a compact village of mud brick houses separated by narrow alleyways, much like the side streets of Saskatoon. Like many farming settlements in the region as recently as the 19th century. At first, only a few communities relied on these cereal crops and kept animals. But increasing populations and unpredictable climate caused these new economies to spread rapidly. Other people caught on quick. They saw something that worked, and they say, I want that. Within a few centuries, thousands of people from Turkey to the Jordan Valley had adopted this new lifestyle with its higher food returns. So you get more for doing less. That's the story of humankind. The people come back as farmers. They're now living in mud brick houses, growing wheat and barley, and hunting gazelle. Within 1,000 years, they begin to herd sheep and goats. Their houses are repeatedly built such that a mound or tell is formed. In this case, one that's a half a kilometer across, 8 meters deep, more than 1 million cubic meters of deposited material. This deposit was excavated for 2 seasons as part of a dam construction salvage operation and now lies at the bottom of Lake Assad. At least 157 different kinds of plants were used, and maybe 100 more were used that weren't recovered. So this project, this hydroelectric project in Syria, has in some ways preserved Albufeira. In other ways, it's made it difficult to get to. So people were willing to put up with social tension, waste, garbage, and depletion of resources associated with village life for a couple of reasons. Why would we want to deal with other people? Some of these reasons are obvious, others might not be. A guy named Marcel Mauss lived with Arctic hunter-gatherers at the turn of the century. This would be the turn of the last century. He noticed that periodic gatherings were characterized by intense communal life that included feasts, religious ceremonies, intellectual discussions, and lots of sex, all reasons that people still get together today. In comparison, the remainder of the year, when people lived in small, far-flung groups, times were rather dull. Climate at the end of the last ice age continued to get warmer and wetter, yielding more and better food until the Younger Dryas hit. Once we came out of the Younger Dryas, we have entered the Holocene, and the modern world begins.